The nursery had always been Maria's secret prayer room, a small, sunlit rectangle off the back of the house, painted a soft, hopeful green, with a crib she had bought and never used, a tiny rocking chair that made a soft creak when she sat in it, and a mobile of paper stars that tilted slowly whenever a breeze slipped through the cracked window. She kept a stack of baby books on the shelf, titles she had read and reread until the spines softened, letters she had written to a child she would never know. On the dresser, a folded onesie lay waiting like an accusation, a soft cotton garment with tiny embroidered footprints, untouched. 2 weeks before the storm, Dr. Wilmer had said 3 sentences that rearranged everything. The tumor is large. It's invasive. Fertility is no longer an option. He had spoken with the precise gentleness of a man who had seen grief before and wanted to make it smaller. But his compassion did not change the sentence. It sat in Maria's chest like a stone. She had come home from that appointment and stood in the nursery until the light went blue and the moon leaned in, and she pressed her forehead against the crib rail, feeling the cold varnish against the damp of her skin. She said a prayer that sounded like a question. She set 2 mugs in the sink, one for herself, one for the child she had imagined, then went to bed with the house too quiet, and the air full of all the things she could not name. When the storm came, it came with a kind of ferocity that made the windows sigh. Rain hammered the roof. The trees in the yard bowed like an old congregation. Maria slept in fits, the kind of sleep that kept tugging her back with electric fingers. At some point in the night, a sound woke her, a small, urgent tapping at the back door. She sat up, heart busy, and listened. The tapping came again, 3 careful little knocks, timid as a bird. She wrapped a sweater around her shoulders and opened the door into rain and wind, into cold and the smell of wet earth. On the low step, hunched against the storm, a child sat curled into herself like a folded paper star, a head of unruly golden curls plastered against a small face, clothes soaked through, shoes squelching mud. The child looked up at Maria with eyes the color of wet concrete and teeth chattering. "Please," the child said, voice barely louder than the rain. "Please, I'm lost." The word landed the way a bell might, high and clear and impossible to ignore. Maria's chest unclenched in the way an old wound sometimes softens. Without thinking, she scooped the child up and carried her inside, shedding water like a sorry cloak. The house filled with the smell of rain and the small, electric warmth of a living thing. She wrapped the child in towels, pressed her own sweater around tiny shoulders, tutored the hair into a tangle that shone like a halo under the lamplight.
The child's hands were cold and a little bruised along the knuckles, like someone who had been clutching a gate or a fence. Maria could feel the small steadying of breath against her jaw. She led her to the kitchen and set a mug of hot chocolate between them, and the child drank like she hadn't had anything for a long time, and the steam braided into the room as if a new life were beginning. "Do you have a name?" Maria asked, and the child looked up with something like a new sun waking in her face. "Angelina," she said. The name fit the child as if it had always been hers, a coat she had just slipped on. That night Angelina slept on the couch while rain drummed on the roof, and the mobile in the nursery turned slow as a planet. Maria watched the child sleep and found that her hands trembled for reasons she could not explain. She thought about calling Christina. She thought about the doctor. She thought about the long list of practicalities, social services, the police, the way paperwork could string a person out of their life. But she did not call anyone. Instead, she sat in the doorway of the nursery and listened to the way the house sounded when a child was under its roof, a quieting that felt like blessing. That first morning after the storm, Maria dressed Angelina in a spare sweater and boots that squeaked and took her to the small bakery on the corner. They walked as if they owned no time, hands brushing sometimes, the child's small steps keeping pace with an older woman's careful stride. In the bakery, Angelina pressed her nose to the glass of the display case and selected a pastry like a queen selecting jewels. She laughed at the flakiest crust and bit into it with a kind of rapture that made Maria think of scripture passages about joy. People in the neighborhood glanced twice. An elderly woman wiped a counter and frowned with the protective instinct of someone who knew children were precious and fragile and sometimes very far from where they should be. A mail carrier paused his route to ask if everything was all right. Maria answered with a calm she did not always feel. "A lost child found," she said. "We're calling the police." It was true, but the phrase was also a promise she was not yet ready to keep. Days unfurled like a ribbon. Maria said she would keep Angelina safe for a night, maybe two, until the authorities sorted out the mess. Each night stretched a little longer. The nights became small labs where Maria could try on a life that might have been hers. She bought tiny lemon-yellow pajamas and a small toothbrush with a cartoon whale on the handle. She arranged a corner of the living room into a makeshift nursery when sunlight came slanted through the curtains. Angelina learned to brush her teeth with solemn concentration, to tie her shoelaces in angry, determined knots, to hum along with the radio while she arranged blocks into impossible towers, and then sighed, content when they toppled.
There were ordinary things that, strung together, felt like prayer. The way Angelina's hair smelled after a bath, the warmth of her hand slipping into Maria's when they crossed the street, the ridiculousness of watching her attempt to eat spaghetti with a spoon. Maria found herself humming again at the kitchen sink. She hummed as she washed dishes, as she folded small clothes, as she made 2 mugs of cocoa and lined them up on the table. She hummed when she woke and when she went to sleep. Christina noticed. She had noticed the first week Maria had returned from the hospital with pamphlets tucked into her bag and a determined emptiness in her eyes. Christina lived 2 houses over and had been a friend for 20 years. She had been there for late nights and for broken hearts, for the funerals and the weddings of people Maria loved. She loved Maria the way a person loves someone who has held their hand through long, dark places. So when Maria started to skip her appointments, Christina's instinct tightened into alarm. "You can't keep doing this," Christina said one evening, folding her hands in a way that tried to look less like accusation and more like support. They were sitting at the small kitchen table. Angelina was curled on the floor, playing with blocks the color of summer fruits. "You can't put your life on hold because of this child. You have treatment scheduled. You know what the doctor said." Maria had her mug clasped with both hands, the ceramic warm against her palms. "She was at my door in the middle of the night, Chris. What would you have me do? Leave her out there?" Her voice cracked on the last phrase. "It's not about leaving her," Christina said. "It's about balance. You could get hurt, and I don't just mean physically. You could lose your chance to fight this because you're wrapped up in rescuing everyone else. Please, let me help. Call the hospital. Go in for the scan. Let me sit with Angelina." Maria looked at Christina and felt the guilt like a wet cloth. "I know," she said. "I know. But I don't want to be alone in the world that's left to me. She makes the house stop being a museum." Christina's face softened in a small, painful way. "You can have both. That's what I'm trying to say. You don't have to choose between fighting for your life and giving kindness." The police took Angelina's statement the next morning. Her version of where she had come from was a patchwork of small memories, homesick details, and the sort of confusion that makes good sense in children. She named streets that did not exist and mentioned a dog that smelled like oranges. The officers filed the report with professional efficiency. Someone in the department suggested posting on the city's missing children's registry. Someone else told Maria to call social services. The forms multiplied like paper boats on a river. Gorete, the social worker, arrived with a tidy stack of folders and an expression practiced to be warm and firm.
She crouched to be at Angelina's level and asked, in a voice meant to be steady, if she had family, if she knew her parents' names. Angelina's face closed into a little shell. "No," she said. "My mama's gone. My papa—" The sentence broke into fragments like spilled beads. Gorette's pen moved across the page. She asked about medical needs, allergies, vaccinations. She asked whether Angelina had a home to go to. "We'll do everything we can," Gorette said finally, "but we need to make sure the child's safe. We have to locate the guardians." Maria felt the bottom of the room drop away a little. She began, but Gorette's trained gaze made a pragmatic note. This was one more case in a city with more needs than resources. "We'll open an immediate inquiry," Gorette said. "We'll check the registries, hospital records. Sometimes families are located through photographs, through social media. We'll post a missing person alert." The internet, in the hours after the storm, was both slow and swift in its own ways. Maria watched a profile photo of Angelina go up and go down again, as if the world could not decide what to do with a small golden head under a rain-damped cap. Flyers printed in the church hall were tacked to telephone poles. Neighbors took pictures and texted them to groups. Someone made a video of Angelina eating a biscuit with exaggerated concentration and shared it with the caption, "Found on my porch during the storm. Any idea?" It was all very public and very impersonal. The police gave Maria a number to call if she learned anything. Garrett said the registry check would take time. The Missing Children Network would, in its own good time, see what details matched what. The bureaucracy had the slow logic of a machine built to be fair. It did not move because of the ache in a single woman's chest. Meanwhile, life, small, ordinary life, kept weaving around them. Maria learned to braid Angelina's hair in clumsy Dutch plaits. She taught her how to fold fitted sheets so they did not fold into stubborn lumps. They baked cookies and left them to cool on the windowsill, then sat cross-legged on the kitchen floor and ate them when they were still blushing warm. Angelina liked to talk about a made-up friend named Little Moon who could fit inside her palm and whispered secrets in the dark. Maria listened, and sometimes she believed. Tullio appeared like a bright and awkward punctuation in this new chapter. He worked at the community center down the street, teaching adults how to read, and he had the kind of easy laugh that sounded sincere, like someone who believed in second chances. They met at a small fundraiser where Maria had gone because Christina had insisted she leave the house for the first time in days. Tullio had a gentle way of asking questions and listening with his whole face.
He asked about the storm and the child, and said, without triumph or judgment, that he could help watch Angelina for an afternoon if it would get Maria to an appointment. Their first date was not a date at all, but a walk that ended in fried plantains and the clumsy promise of seeing each other again. He made no grand proclamations. He did not speak in cliches about healing. He simply sat across from Maria, and when she spoke, he listened like her words mattered, because they were hers. When he reached out and tucked a loose curl behind her ear, Maria felt the small shock of being noticed in the way that felt like the first time someone had not been looking past her. But joy, even newly made, lives under a fragile weather. The doctors called for scans. A letter from the specialist arrived with typed instructions that felt like a countdown. Dr. Wilmer, with his quiet urgency, reminded Maria that time mattered. "We can do more if we act now," he said, each syllable kind and firm, like an instruction manual for a machine that could save her. He explained the risks, the options, the ways the tumor could be addressed. He talked about chemotherapy, about targeted treatment, about the possibility of preserving as much as could be preserved. Maria heard it all, and then heard her own voice saying, "I want to wait until after she's found." The room went very small. Dr. Wilmer's face was a map of professional sympathy. "You're asking us to delay critical care for an unknown duration," he said. "That is risky." "It feels like I can't do both," Maria said. The words were honest and raw. "How do I go back to the hospital and leave her here?" "You can arrange guardianship. You can make legal decisions for the time being. You can allow us to proceed with care while ensuring the child is looked after. There are options, Maria." She left the office with a folder of pamphlets, a list of legal forms, and her hands empty, as if she had been expected to leave something behind. Outside, the sun pretended there had been no storm, and filtered through a row of maple trees in the medical center parking lot. Maria drove home slowly, the steering wheel warm under the palms of her hands, and told herself she would think about it tomorrow. Skips and compromises accumulated. Maria went to some appointments and missed others. She scheduled treatments and then canceled because Angelina had woken from a nightmare, palms on the window panes, whispering about shadows. Christina called with the voice of someone drawing a line in the sand. "Tomorrow," she said. "You go. No more postponing." The community started to murmur in the small ways communities do. A neighbor saw Angelina in the park and raised a speculative question, as if they were gossiping about a film. Someone left a note on Maria's door, stiff, officious, about the legal complications of harboring an unregistered minor. The local paper ran a small piece. "Child found after storm. Inquiry open."
The reporter had a camera with a lens that could turn private things public. One evening, after a day of errands and an ill-fitting attempt at normalcy, Maria sat at the kitchen table with her laptop open, watching grainy footage from a neighbor's security camera. The camera was positioned to keep an eye on the alley, a practical thing. Maria had asked to look at the footage because small details sometimes lived in surveillance: faces, a car, a shadow. Christina had suggested that perhaps some neighbor might remember a van, a jacket, a snippet of conversation that would fit into the shape of a family story. They watched frames of the street, rain blurring the edges, a cat slinking past, the reflection of a streetlight. Then a figure came into view, a small, soaked shape moving toward Maria's gate. But as the clip advanced, the frames where Angelina should be were like missing teeth in a jaw. There were starts and stops. 1 second of a child on the curb, the next, nothing. The camera had, for reasons not yet explained, swallowed whole sections where movement should have been. Christina leaned forward. "Maybe the feed glitched," she said. "Cameras fail. It happens." Maria's fingers hovered above the keyboard. The missing frames felt like a hand pulling at the fabric of reality. There were other strange things. A neighbor's CCTV 2 streets over had days of footage that were fine except for a single 20-minute gap that coincided with the time the child was said to have been outside the house. A grocery store camera, facing the parking lot, recorded a woman, someone with a red coat, walking past at the time a passerby remembered seeing a child alone. But when they called the grocery store, the manager said something non-committal. Camera footage was archived in rotation, and sometimes it was overwritten before they had time to check. It was too much coincidence, and in the space beside coincidence, doubt crept in like a cold draft. Maria wondered if she had misremembered how her feet felt on the stairs the night she had let Angelina sleep on the couch. She wondered if the nursery mobile had ever turned at all. She wondered in the small private corners of her mind whether she had seen what she thought she had seen. Still, there were mornings when Angelina's laugh filled the house like a chorus and the world felt true. There were afternoons when the child brought a small, weird treasure, a marble the color of a storm, a hand-drawn picture of two people with hearts between them, and Maria tucked each one into a box she had labeled for later. Those things were not nothing. One Saturday, while Maria was on a short trip to the pharmacy, a man in a navy suit stood on the step of her house. He had an air like someone who kept appointments with people in power. He introduced himself to Christina and said he was from a private family office making inquiries on behalf of a client.
He asked for the child's name in a tone that made the hair on the back of Maria's neck stand up. Christina, practical and unflappable, gave him the basics without letting in inside the house. The man left a card that had no name, just a phone number and a promise. If there is anything you need to share, call this number. A few days later, a social worker from the district called to say a match had come up in a database query. A child reported missing months earlier from a wealthy family in another part of the city. The details were scant. The child had been adopted in a private placement. The child had been traveling with a small group when records showed an absence. The report included a vague note that the family had resources and had initiated a private inquiry. Maria stared at the message as if it were a map to something that did not exist. Her heart did a small, strange thing. Relief tasted like rain, cool and immediate, and fear rode in with it. If this was the child's family, what would it mean to lose the soft miracle of mornings and the small restored rituals? What might it mean for the safety she had found inside a cave of simple domesticities? But underneath those practical concerns was a quieter, more urgent question. Who exactly had left a little girl at her door in the middle of a storm? The more she searched, the less some things made sense. Flyers that had gone up in the neighborhood had a blank space where a photograph should have been. Printers sometimes spat out paper devoid of image, as if someone had run a photocopy through with a rubbed-out face. When Maria took a flyer to the newspaper office to request a reprint, the clerk apologized and said their files showed no image had been uploaded. "It's like the photo file wasn't there," he said, shaking his head. "Maybe a technical glitch." At night, alone, Maria sometimes thought the idea of a glitch was a softer way of saying a miracle. She could not decide if that frightened her more or less. She prayed in small phrases, not seeking thunderbolts or loud answers, but somehow wishing for the kind of consolation that arrives with a cup of tea in a quiet kitchen. She felt guilty for praying for simple things when her body had a tumor that kept making its own demands, but compassion had opened a corner of her heart she did not want to close. People in the neighborhood called her brave or reckless, depending on how much they had come to know. Some left casseroles on the porch, and a few left angry notes about legal responsibilities. The local church offered a community lawyer for advice. The woman who ran the Sunday coffee group took Angelina under her wing at a Sunday morning service, coaxing the child into coloring books and hymns with the soft tenacity of someone who believed the church should be first and foremost a refuge. For all the daily rituals and the warming kindness, the strain mounted. Maria slept less.
She found herself scolding herself in the same way she sometimes scolded compost that would not break down, gently, insistently, with a face that tried to look resolute. She called Dr. Wilmer and made another appointment, and then canceled because Angelina had a fever that night. She told herself there would be a time for scans and consultations, for decisions made with the sober clarity of paperwork and a calendar. She told herself that when the time came, she would be ready. Then, on a late Monday afternoon, the police called back with something that did not fit any of the neat boxes their forms offered. A tip had come into the department, a recorded message left anonymously at the switchboard, claiming that a child matching Angelina's description had been seen getting into a black SUV 2 nights prior near the Riverwalk. Surveillance there was spotty. The only camera that might have caught the vehicle had been vandalized that week and was out of service. The lead felt like a cat scratch, a small, sharp thing that might be nothing. But for the first time in weeks, Maria experienced the prickling wonder of outer forces turning. A journalist called to ask about the mysterious girl who appeared during the storm, and Maria declined to speak, folding her hands and saying she was waiting for official word. The man on the line left a message full of hungry questions and the promise of a headline. Everything began to feel as if it were braced on the hinge of something. A van with a satellite dish idled 2 houses down one morning and then moved on. A woman in a tailored coat took notes on her phone while standing in the rain, and then looked up at the nursery window as if she had recognized something in the curtains. An unmarked SUV with a dark window appeared across the street and stayed for long enough that Maria noticed the way its shadow seemed to watch the house. That night, Maria sat in the dark with the curtains drawn and Angelina sleeping soundly next to the small glow of a nightlight in the shape of a moon. She reached out and touched the child's hair, and it shivered under her fingers like little waves. Her mind filled with 1,000 possible stories, some simple and sane, others braided with myth. She imagined a woman at a distant desk pressing a call in the middle of the night for a child who had wandered, for a daughter who had been missing. She imagined doors opening because people with power make them open. If there was a hand of providence at work, she thought, perhaps it worked in ways that included phone calls and legal teams and the slow but steady machinery of state systems. She allowed herself, for a sliver of time, to believe that the child's arrival, so improbable and sudden, was part of a larger story in which kindness was currency. The phone rang in the quiet. It was a number Maria had not seen before. She let it ring until the voicemail picked up.
When she played the message, a voice with a corporate hush said, "We are aware of the situation on Garza Lane. If the child in your care is Angelina Ruiz, please answer with the word yes." Maria's mouth went dry. For a moment, the room tilted. Angelina slept, oblivious to the small gravity that might shift her life. Maria pressed her hand to her heart and found that it was racing in a rhythm that felt like both fear and an opening. She wanted to call Christina, to call Dr. Wilmer, to call anyone who could anchor this moment to a map. But the number was one she did not recognize, and the message had a precision that made her feel watched in the kindest and the sharpest ways. She lifted the phone and, with a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else, said the word into the receiver, "Yes." There was no immediate reply. On the kitchen table, the laptop hummed and the screen showed a paused frame of the neighbor's camera where the child's outline had once been. Outside, a car rolled past and the tires made a faint, distant hiss. The night pressed close. It felt, in the center of her chest, like standing on the edge of something vast, hope braided with a prickle of dread. She could not know if what came next would be the beginning of rescue or the dismantling of the fragile world she had been trying to build. She wrapped her arms around herself and listened to the house settle, to the small sound of sleep near the couch, and to the rain beginning again against the glass, as if the world was wiping a slate clean and writing the next line. The message on the answering machine was still there when morning came, clear, careful, the kind of voice that belonged to people whose work was arranging other people's lives. Maria had listened to it twice before she dared to breathe. She told herself she would call Christina, tell her everything, and then she found she was already on the phone with the number that had left the message. "Hello?" A woman's voice answered, steady and close to a translator's neutral. "We received your confirmation. My name is Elena. I represent a private family office assisting in a missing person inquiry. We would like to speak with the child and with you, Miss Garza, if you will allow it." The line felt thin and unreal and too heavy at once. Maria said, Yes, she is here. Angelina is here." "You did the right thing calling the police," Elena said. "We'll coordinate with them. Could you please have the child speak to me for a moment?" Angelina woke to the sound of her name spoken like a small bell. She came into the kitchen in pajamas, hair tousled, and paused as if there were a story she had misplaced. Maria watched the way the child's eyes studied the telephone. Then the woman on the other end's voice reached across the wire like a hand. "Angelina," Elena said, "can you tell me your full name?" "Angelina Ruiz," the child said.
The name, when she said it, had the shy finality of a small thing pressed into a pocket. There was a pause. On the far end of the line, Elena's tone softened. "Angelina, I need to ask you about a tiny mark behind your left ear. Do you have a small crescent-shaped scar there?" Angelina reached instinctively and felt the small ridge just behind her ear, pale and smooth beneath the hair. "Yes," she said, "it's like a moon." Maria's stomach turned. The detail matched something wordless and exact that had lived in the back of her mind since the first night Angelina had curled in her lap. A tiny crescent mark the child had tucked away with her thumb when she slept, as if it were a secret charm. "We'll be there within the hour," Elena said. "Please stay where you are. We are coordinating with the police and social services." When the line clicked, Maria sat back as if someone had removed the air from the room. Outside, the rain had sloughed off into a steady domestic drizzle. Inside, the kitchen smelled like coffee and old warmth. Angelina climbed into Maria's lap and nuzzled, as if meaning to make the moment ordinary again. Christina arrived before the team. She had come because Maria had called and, for once, had allowed herself to be helped. She stood at the doorway looking like someone who had walked through fire and kept their hair intact by sheer will. Her face was composed, but her eyes told a story of sleepless nights and hard decisions. "You called them?" she asked without preamble. "Yes," Maria said. Her voice sounded small. Christina hugged her as if the hug could hold the moment in place. "Good," she said. "Good. We'll get this sorted, and you'll get the care you need. You'll see." It would not be sorted in an hour. It would not be solved in a line of clean paperwork. But the engines that had been quietly turning, Elena's private inquiry, the police file, Gorete making calls at social services, had found each other like the hands of people who mean to find what was missing. The team that arrived to the house was not one person, but a polite procession. There was a lawyer with a briefcase who talked in plain sentences, a woman from social services who had gentle manners and a folder full of printed forms, and 2 security professionals who moved with measured steps. Their arrival felt both intrusive and inevitable. A small, neat press pack waited at the curb beyond the hedges, but no one let them inside the threshold. Elena's voice managed the angle between discretion and disclosure. "Ms. Garza," the lawyer said, "we need to take some basic information and to make an identification. We also need to arrange for a short medical check to ensure Angelina is safe." Angelina agreed to the check in a way that made Maria's chest ache. She allowed a nurse to look in her ears, to count her breaths, to take her temperature. The nurse hummed like a lullaby as she worked, murmuring about how strong the child was and how well she was eating.
"She's stable," she said to Maria. "Just a little dehydrated. We'll make sure she's fine." The legal identification was less sweet. The lawyer asked questions in a tone that suggested he had seen versions of this before. Adoptions, private placements, travel arrangements gone wrong. He produced a tablet and a list of paperwork that, for reasons of privacy and procedure, he could not share all at once. Elena answered and asked, and once, when Angelina happened to move her hair, she pointed to the crescent scar and breathed like someone who had been expecting an answer and had just found it. That afternoon, a car with dark windows waited around the corner. It drew nearer and then slowed to a careful stop across the street. A man stepped out whose presence had the quiet certainty of someone used to being obeyed without noise. He wore a coat that kept the rain away and a kind of neutrality that could be mistaken for reserve. Around him moved assistants, an attorney, a public relations person who tucked herself behind him like a shadow. When the man caught sight of Angelina through the kitchen window, his shoulders gave a micro-relief he did not try to hide. Maria felt the movement in the room like a ripple. The man, whose name would appear in time and print, and whose face would be discussed in coffee shops and news feeds, crossed the street and came to the front path with the deliberate step of someone who had rehearsed diplomacy. He did not speak first. He watched Angelina with a look that was not predatory but reverent, an adult's astonishment at a small human being entirely uncalibrated by the world's expectations. When he spoke, his voice was careful and quiet. "My name is Marco Delgado," he said. "I understand this is difficult. I only want to know she is safe." Angelina, for reasons that belong to the kind of honesty only children possess, walked to the door and looked up at him. "Are you my papa?" she asked. The question landed like a shard of light. Marco's face changed in a way that was both human and private. He crouched down to meet her eye level and put his hand over his heart. "I am looking for my daughter," he said, "but I am not here to make anything harder for you, Miss Garza. I am grateful for what you have done." There was 1,000 lines of consequence in that sentence, legal complications, press interest, the tug-of-war that unmoored people's lives. But for a moment the world reduced itself to the small square of space between an old woman, a child, and a man with an astonished face. Maria felt something like a holy hush pass through her ribs.
Social services filed paperwork. The police logged statements. Elena coordinated with a sheriff's liaison in a tone that implied timelines and caution. The press waited across the street, and a light rain fell as if the sky itself were deciding whether to cleave the moment into public and private halves.
The first public, decisive moment came in an exchange that was as small as a signature. Marco asked to see Angelina's medical records and to answer a few questions from the social worker. He asked if she would be willing to have a quick fingerprint and cheek swab for identification. Those bits of procedure, clinical, dull, legal, were the hinge on which the title's truth would swing from rumor to fact. Angelina sat on Maria's lap with a quiet trust that made Maria's heart ache in a new way. She let a technician take a swab from the inside of her cheek. The sample was labeled and sent for preliminary screening. It was hardly a full genetic confirmation, not in the time it took to brew coffee. But human recognition also happened in other, less scientific ways. Marco's eyes kept darting to the crescent scar behind the child's ear. He whispered a set of names, nicknames he had used in the house where photographs showed a small face with the same moon-like mark. Michelle, he said softly, as if speaking to an old photograph. She had called her Angel sometimes. She used to say moon songs. If this had been a simpler world, one exchange would have decided everything. But life accumulates caveats. Marco explained that Angelina had been adopted years earlier. The family had engaged in private, closed adoption through a professional placement. For a time, the adoption had been private and joyful, and followed by the protective silence wealthy families often impose. Weeks before, Marco said, a set of circumstances had led to the child being separated from a small traveling group. He had opened a private inquiry when the group reported her missing. For privacy reasons, we didn't go public, Marco said. That was a mistake. We thought we could find her without making a scene. We didn't expect this. And when we learned that a child might be in the care of a good person, he looked at Maria. We were grateful beyond words. That night, after the legal forms were signed and Elena had arranged for a discreet transfer into an official agency's temporary care, Marco asked to speak to Maria alone on the porch. He carried with him a small envelope and an air of someone who had rehearsed gratitude and legalese until they were indistinguishable. I can only say thank you, he told her. When people are what they are supposed to be, when they offer simple kindness, sometimes the world rearranges itself for the better. I want to do something to help you. I'm not, he hesitated, choosing words that would not feel like charity offered as a bribe. I'm not trying to buy your silence or your good grace. I want to help with your medical care. I want to make sure your doctors can do what they need to do. Maria's reply was a complicated movement in her ribs. Part of her wanted to say no charity, no strings. Part of her wanted to reach for the help as if it were the last rung of a ladder. Christina watched from the kitchen window with her jaw set, alert as a watchman.
You don't have to accept anything, Marco said. But if the offer helps ensure you get the care you need, I hope you'll consider it. Whatever else had been in Maria's chest that night, the grief, the fear, the stubborn refusal to pick between saving herself or keeping the child, was swaddled in the precise public fact that now hovered between them. Angelina was the missing child of a man with resources. The newspaper across town would soon write a version of it. The social worker would file an official notice. But for the small, private thing that had happened in Maria's kitchen, coffee, the hum of the fridge, the tilt of light in the nursery, the truth carried with it the taste of rain and something like mercy. Maria accepted the offer with a voice that shook but did not break. We'll need time, she said. I'm not ready to let her go without knowing how it will be. We'll work with you, Marco replied. We'll find a way for you to have contact. We don't want to erase what's happened here. It was not a promise he could legally keep in all its detail. The lawyer who stood near the hedges would later explain custodial law and parental rights and the limits of private influence. But there was a tone to Marco's voice that made it sound like an invitation rather than a command. Maria believed, cautiously. The hospital corridor smelled of antiseptic and slow time. Dr. Wilmer met them with the map of a man who held hard facts and the softer edges of human hope. The plan, once the finances were arranged and Marco's office had transferred funds for a second opinion at a specialized clinic, was a surgical intervention followed by a careful regimen. It would be risky. It would not promise fertility. It would, with luck and skill and post-operative follow-up, remove the tumor that had been the ragged center of Maria's grief. You did the right thing getting to the hospital, Dr. Wilmer said as he outlined risks and possibilities.
We cannot promise anything, but with the resources and the surgical team, we can attempt a full resection. Then we'll see how the tissue responds to adjuvant therapy. There's cautious optimism. That's the best honest thing I can offer. Cautious optimism was a phrase that could be both merciless and tender, and Maria took it like a small cup. Tullio sat in the waiting room with his hands folded, sometimes reading, sometimes staring into the distance. He had become a steady presence who did not fill the air with promises. His voice had become the kind of place where things could be put down carefully. When Maria stepped out of the operating theater days later, exhausted and oddly light from anesthesia and from the literal removal of the mass that had sat in her pelvis, Tullio's hand found hers. "You came back," he said simply. "Everyone came back," she answered. Her laugh was a thin, surprised thing. "Everyone came back." The pathology report, when it came, was a mixed blessing.
The tumor was removed with clear margins. There was no immediate sign of metastasis. The tissue would undergo further testing. There might be chemotherapy. There might be periods of recovery that could last months. Dr. Wilmer said the words that surgeons say when they are trying to be both truthful and kind. "We did what we could. We'll monitor. We'll give you options. We'll preserve function where possible." He did not promise fertility. He did not promise that the child she had imagined in the nursery would ever coo in her arms. What he offered was a path forward: treatment, follow-up, the possibility of assisted methods that might one day be considered. Maria took that path, step by slow step, with Tullio's hand and Christina's lists and Marco's resources providing scaffolding around it. There was a legal seam to mend. Social services arranged a formal transfer of custody that made everything both easier and harder. Angelina, on a set of official forms and a photograph, was entered as the adopted daughter of Marco Delgado. The adoption had occurred years earlier. The family file showed private placements and a small set of references. Marco's team had been searching by channels they could not publicize. The public revelation that followed was tempered. They held back details that would harm a child who had already known more upheaval than anyone her size should, and spoke instead of gratitude. At a small press conference held in the garden outside Maria's house, where tulips had been cut and set in glasses, and where the rain that had once been angry now fell soft as blessing, Marco spoke. He used words like mistake and private inquiry and regret for the family's earlier failure to go public. He offered thanks, public, deep thanks, to the woman who had opened her door during a storm. "We are profoundly grateful," he said, voice measured. "Ms. Garza did what every person of conscience should do. She took in a child in need. Angelina is my daughter. She has been missing from our home, and we will care for her. We will also care for Ms. Garza. There are debts that cannot be repaid by money. There are gestures that are merely courtesy. But we will make sure Ms. Garza receives the medical attention she needs, and that a relationship can be formed in a way that is healthy and safe for the child." The local paper's headline the next day read, in the small type of civic pride, "Local woman who sheltered missing girl to be acknowledged by family." The story did not capture the precise gravity of the nights when Maria had watched Angelina sleep, or the small rituals that had made a house feel like a home. It captured the facts most willing to be printed: the name of a billionaire in the city, a legal confirmation of adoptive ties, a commitment of funds for medical treatment. It danced on the edge of what was holy and what was public.
There was also a private choreography that unfolded, agreement about visitation, a schedule that would not sever the threads Maria and Angelina had made, legal guardianship in the short term, while the social worker ensured a healthy plan. Marco insisted that the girl receive counseling to process the confusion, and he invited Maria to be part of a network of adults who would support Angelina without press fanfare. For all the press, he wanted ordinary things: playdates, bedtime stories, a continuity that would not fracture a small life into headlines. The day Angelina returned to Marco's house for the first time under his care, Maria stood on the porch and watched the little figure in the car seat. The child reached for Maria's hand, and Marco met it with a gentlemanly pause, as if he understood the economy of simple touches. When Angelina waved, Maria felt the childhood she had lived inside her chest dislodge and rearrange into something like a new landscape. "You don't owe me anything," Maria told Marco in a small voice. She stopped. Words felt clumsy for the shape of what she wanted to say. "You gave her shelter," he answered. "You gave her a place to be safe. That is everything." He left an envelope of medical contacts and arranged for a case manager to speak with Dr. Wilmer. He offered to have Angelina's school counselor join therapy sessions that included Maria, so a relationship could be maintained without confusion or harm.
Nobody in the room uttered the easy word of adoption, as if it could rewrite a month of stolen mornings. Instead, they found the slow language of arrangements and careful promises. Some people in town whispered that a wealthy man had taken the child back. Others said that what had happened had been providential, that the child's presence had been nothing less than a blessing meant to change lives. Maria herself had a more complicated sense. She believed in grace in ways that had nothing to do with headlines, and everything to do with small things. A toothbrush with a whale on the handle, the shiver of a child's hair, a shared pastry. She believed, too, in systems, hospitals, courts, social workers, that could be both flawed and necessary. Weeks turned into months. The clinic's hallways became familiar. Dr. Wilmer's careful optimism bore the texture of work. Scans every few weeks, appointments to monitor progress, rehabilitation that was less dramatic than the films made it seem, but real, steady, and cumulative. Angelina's visits continued on a schedule that let her know she was not being pulled from one life into another like an object to be moved. She had family in a house that smelled of polished wood and distant music, and she had Maria, who, in small and meaningful ways, remained part of the spaces she had once inhabited. Tullio stood beside Maria at more appointments than she could count.
He read her the medical leaflets with a patient gentleness, sometimes pausing to laugh at the absurdity of medical jargon, sometimes simply squeezing her hand in waiting rooms. Christina kept a binder of dates and forms, and was the person who could make telephone calls on behalf of someone who was exhausted to make them. They became a ring of people who carried her where she could not walk alone. In time, the lab called with results that, in their bluntness, felt like a blessing. The margins were clear. The oncologist used the word favorable with a caution that Maria wanted to sing. There might be follow-up chemo or targeted therapy, he said. There might be effects that lingered. Fertility could be possible. Further consultations with a reproductive specialist would be needed. The language was careful, full of ifs and maybes, which meant it was honest in the way that mattered. On a Sunday in late spring, Marco organized a modest gathering, no press, invited family only, at a small chapel near the river. He had insisted on it with the awkwardness of a man trying to do what felt right. He wanted to meet the people who had kept his daughter safe. He wanted to say something that was not a press release. He had a quiet way of giving thanks that made no promises but held a kind of human pledge. Maria sat in the third pew, hands folded, and watched as Angelina climbed onto Marco's lap and sang a hymn in a small, surprising lilt. Tullio stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder. Christina's knitting needles clicked in the pew like a soft metronome. Marco told a story about a small child who liked to call the moon her friend. He said that the family had chosen to name the girl Angelina after a grandmother who had sung lullabies. He said simply, "She is my daughter," and he said it with the syntax of a fact that had been confirmed, and the tenderness of a truth that had been earnestly reclaimed. When the service ended, Marco made a short private offer to Maria, an offer not for adoption, not for replacement, but for support, and for the kind of relationship adults sometimes have when their lives become unexpectedly braided. "If you'll allow it," he said, "I would like to arrange for Angelina to see you often. We both, my family and I, feel that she has been loved here. I don't want to sever what was given to her." Maria had imagined that the first time she would say yes to that would be in a courtroom or in an interview with a counselor, but she said it then, in the hush of the pews, with a voice that felt like it had been shaped by months of small courage. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'd like that." The months after the service were not cinematic. They were the slow work of daily life, appointments, therapy, grocery runs, day trips that were short and domestic. There were afternoons when Angelina came for a biscuit, and another when she spent the night in the modest guest room to the chorus of polite adult conversations and the soft click of a nightlight.
Marco kept his promises with the bluntness of someone who had the means to do so. He ensured that Maria had access to specialists, and he made quiet arrangements to pay for a fertility consultation without dramatizing it as a gift. There were gestures that were generous and gestures that were awkward, and always, underneath, the knowledge that money solved some problems and could not mend other kinds of absences. In private, Maria grappled with the small ache that had been with her before the rain, what she had lost and what she had gained. There were mornings when she sat in the nursery with a cup of coffee and ran her finger over the embroidery on the untouched onesie. There were nights when she dreamed of a life that had been otherwise and woke with gratitude for the life she had been allowed to salvage. She never stopped praying, not in the formal sense, but in the small rituals that had come to mean everything, pausing to be grateful, telling the people near her that she loved them, opening letters from the clinic and reading them with careful hope.
She spoke to God not in demands, but in the low language of people who know their own need. A petition for wisdom, a request for steady hands, a simple thanks for the people who had shown up in her life when it had been needed most. There were moments of strain. Gossip still flitted along the edges of the neighborhood like restless birds. There were articles that tried to turn the story into a morality play. There were people who asked questions about why a billionaire's child had been found on Maria's porch. For her part, Maria had been asked in the curious tones of strangers whether she believed a miracle had occurred. Her answer was always the same, that she had experienced something inexplicable in the way a child's laugh can change the architecture of a day. She used words like grace and blessing and left them open enough to mean different things to different listeners. One winter evening, when the clinic had separated out a plan that allowed for cautious expectation, a surgical success, a prescribed course, the possibility that assisted reproductive technology might be an option in the future, Maria sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter. She wrote to Angelina in the small, clumsy cursive of someone trying to keep memory alive. She told the child about the day she had found her in the rain, about the way a pastry had tasted like a small joy, about the way their mornings had folded themselves into each other. "You taught me to live again," she wrote. "You showed me how to laugh when the light is good. I do not know what the future holds. I do not know how many times we will sit together with Coco, or how often you will visit. But I know this, you woke something in me that will not die." Angelina's response, scribbled with a wobble of crayons on paper with hearts, said simply, "I like you. You made me cookies. I like the moon."
Later, Marco arranged for an event not of publicity, but of courtesy, a small foundation fundraiser in which he thanked the community for its role in finding his daughter and provided scholarships for community families dealing with unexpected crises. He dedicated a short part of the evening to Maria, and he asked her to come on stage to accept a token of gratitude, the kind of gesture that, while it could be described as orchestrated by a public relations team, felt in the moment like something honest. He spoke of shelter and of the ethics of kindness, and of the way one small act can change many lives. When Maria stood before the audience, the room blurred around the edges. She had learned to be seen a little at a time, to let strangers watch the slowness of recovery. Marco spoke of Angelina as his daughter, of the private pain of losing her, and of the gratitude his family felt to the woman who had opened her door in the rain. He did not make extravagant claims. He did not promise miraculous cures for anyone else. He invited people to be kind, to support local services, to offer relief to people on the edges. Afterwards, when the room had emptied into polite clusters and the lights dimmed to a soft suffusion, a dozen people came to speak to Maria. Some thanked her as if she had saved a small life single-handedly. Some asked practical questions about where to donate. Others offered hugs that were clumsy and real. Angelina, clinging to Marco's hand, waved at Maria as if she knew the invisible tether that would always exist between them. In the quiet that followed, Maria sat with Tullio and Christina and looked at the small, ordinary life she had rebuilt. The tumor had been excised. Her future would involve surveillance, possibly further therapy, the tiny terror that patient people learn to live with. She had, though, a new constellation, a daughter who was legally and publicly Marco Delgado's adopted child, but who was also, in the secret ledger of small mornings, Maria's. It was not the ending she had prayed for in the nursery. It was not the simple miracle of a child appearing and forever remaining in an old woman's arms. It was, instead, a more complicated grace, the coming together of resources and compassion, of private pain and public obligation. It required humility, legal forms, medical teams, and the kind of generosity that could not be separated entirely from privilege. In the last scene of this season of her life, a small private epilogue, Maria stood in the nursery and watched Angelina wave at her through a car window as she was driven to a small summer camp organized by the family. The child's hair shone like a small sun. She pressed her palm to the glass as if making a vow. "See you next week," Angelina said, and her voice turned the promise into a small, steady thing. Maria thought of the onesie folded on the dresser and smiled in a way that meant the house was no longer a museum.
It was not a home filled with the child she had once imagined as her own, but it was a house that had known the warmth of a child's presence, and that had been changed by it. She had been remade in small, essential ways. She had been given more time, more health care, and a second chance at living a life that included love that looked different from what she had once imagined. On the lawn that had once been the theater of a storm, a van with a discreet plate pulled away, and a woman with a briefcase walked home in the late light. Maria stood in the doorway and breathed the air as if it were a sacrament, small and ordinary and enough. She did not call it divine in a way that would obey doctrinal rigor. She called it gratitude. She folded the word into her life like a compact scarf and wore it out into the yard.
If anyone asked her later what she had learned, she would say it in the kind of sentence that sounded like confession and like benediction at once, that mercy often comes disguised as practical help, that people with power can do good when they choose to, and that sometimes the greatest miracles are the ones that happen because ordinary people open their doors. She would say too that compassion had opened doors for her, that a child's laughter had unhinged a grief that felt immovable, that the truth could be complicated and kind at once. And in the quiet of the nursery, where paper stars still tilted in a draft, Maria stacked the boxes she had marked for later and added a new one, addressed simply Visits. She put inside it a line of notes, a calendar of visits, a small toothbrush with a whale, a photograph of a pastry eaten together on a rainy morning. She closed the box and set it on the shelf, not as a relic of what might have been, but as a testament to what had been given, a life disentangled from despair, a child whose identity had been clarified in public record, Angelina, the billionaire's adopted daughter, and a woman who had been given a second chance to live. If this story touched you, stay with us to the end. There are more quiet, true tales ahead. For now, Maria turned off the nursery light, listened to the city breathe in the distance, and felt, without fanfare, a fullness she had thought impossible.